Right, so I want to thank everyone joining us at the Ella Project today for our latest Zoom webinar. This is part two of a great conversation following up with our January conversation on music management and booking agencies with Mike Kappus. For those of y'all who didn't see part one, it is available on our YouTube feed. If you've RSVP'd to this, you already have the link to that. You can go directly to it. You can also just type in Mike Kappus Ella Project into Google and it'll pop right up. But we're going to record this as well. So we're thrilled to have Mike with us. We're thrilled that you guys have joined us. In a little bit, I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Ashley Keaton, who's going to introduce us and take us through today's webinar. For those of y'all who do not know, Ella Project is based here in New Orleans, Louisiana. We are a pro bono legal services provider and arts business development organization. We focus on all art forms. Music is certainly a big thing with us being in New Orleans, but we work with visual artists, filmmakers, nonprofit organizations and the like. We run weekly legal clinics that Ashley oversees via our partnership with Tulane Law School. I know we have some of our Tulane law students on this call today, so it's great to see y'all joining us as well, a few alums as well. And we hope to do monthly seminars, either by Zoom or at our physical location here at the New Orleans Jazz Museum in the French Quarter of New Orleans. Always take a look out for those as we're going to continue to have them throughout the summer. And in the fall, we'll do our big music business intensive, our crescendo program, which I know some of y'all have done. And some of y'all asked about doing, which is an 8-week program that runs every Tuesday nights through a lot of music business aspects. But that's in the future, and that's not today. Today, we're thrilled to have Mike with us again to run through some of the unanswered questions, more information, bring even more knowledge from his illustrious career that he's sharing with us here in New Orleans. And I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Ashley Keaton, who's going to take us the rest of the way. Welcome, Ashley.
I was unmuting myself, sorry. Thank you, Gene. Thank you for the introduction. And it is such a pleasure to be here with all of you and with my friend, Mike Kappus, who I'm going to thank again for joining us in the second round, the second conversation on music and management and agencies, which I think was very illuminating the first time. And one of the things I love about Mike is that he's so generous with his time, even being, one of the world's well-recognized by many as one of the best, if not the best, music manager and agent. So it is very, very nice of him to continue this conversation because he really, really believes in the importance of educating artists and empowering artists and for purposes of furthering like the creative content that you all give to the world and make the world a better place. And as far as I'm concerned, and without again being a little too warm and fuzzy, like it's just that's part of the Ella Project's mission is to support your work, and to have someone like Mike who is seasoned and experienced as he is, contribute to these workshops and provide opportunities for you all to learn from him is just such a blessing. So thank you, Mike. And what I will do is, I'm going to keep my mouth shut for the most part because, Mike has a lot more information than I will ever have about this topic. So Mike, I know that from our last session that you felt like there were some things that you had missed that you wanted to make sure that our audience received from you. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is to recap the overarching, the overarching takeaway from our first session when it comes to working with managers and agents and promoting with respect to the artist promoting a prosperous career.
All right, well, there's one sentence I use that very generalized, but it's a good thing to keep in mind for everybody, is that building a successful career in general is developing positive awareness through whatever means you have at your disposal so that fans will choose to spend their time and or their money on your projects in addition to or instead of their other options, of which there are so many. So you have to stand out in whatever way you can. That can be, you know, these days a TikTok thing or a television show or a benefit that you perform on, whatever, just to continue to build the positive awareness. And there's many ways to do that. And there's one thing about the business, it's very fluid. People can go from road manager to agent to record company president. So there's a lot of different elements to it. There's also a lot of horror stories. So I've lived through a lot and watched a lot of others. And so hopefully we can share some information that maybe can spare you a few of the horror stories.
Well, okay, so speaking of that information, I know that, you know, you had talked about finding the right agent and manager at length in the previous session, but I know that there were some things that you wanted to, there were some points that you wanted to make that you felt you missed the last time. So if you wanted to start talking about talent buyers and venues and some of the other points that you wanted to make, that would be fantastic.
You know, my philosophy was always to stay small and focused and make sure the artist got as much attention as possible. So we ended up while sometimes only signing 1 or 2 artists or maybe no artists in a given year, we'd be passing on 1,000, 1,500 artists. So when we did that, then a lot of the artists would say, well, where do we go? How can we find a good manager or agent? So I would recommend always, and I bring this up again from the last session too, because it's such a commonly asked question for us. I always suggest going to the talent buyer club or festival, anybody you know actually, but a talent buyer at a club where if you're an artist and if you've been doing well in a certain place, ask that talent buyer for suggestions, because talent buyers are inundated by calls from agents and managers more than any other individual probably in the business. And if you're playing a club where you make sense, then they're probably getting a lot of calls from other agents of similar artists. So they can tell you which ones are reliable, which ones to stay away from. This guy might be really good for you. This woman might be really good for you. So they're the ones that are going to have the greatest knowledge. But also, and one of the things I neglected to mention the last time, I think, is that it can also be friends or other people that you admire from a distance, and go to their website and see who are their contacts, who are their representatives. And if you do that consistently with a large number of people, you might see the same names showing up a lot. But also, if you know anybody that you think is doing well, ask them about their manager, not only who their manager is, but how they feel about them. Because sometimes a manager can manage a successful artist, and the artist is successful more because of their own talent than that of the manager themselves. So you want to get information. That's what this whole call is about, is the more information you have, the better, you know, to get through your career. So I used an example before, a singer-songwriter who I worked with for a long time, signed with a new manager, and he assumed this was a good thing. One of his highly respected friends was with the manager, and he called that guy and said, hey, I'm on the same team now. And he said, oh, you should have asked me. I'm leaving. The guy doesn't know what he's doing, you know. So gather information, and especially if it's something like going with an agent or manager, and you can talk to other clients of that agent or manager. That's really important to get. Are you happy with them? Or are you about to leave because they're not competent? You know, so gather information always as much as possible.
Good. And you have said, you know, don't ever just sign with someone just to have a manager.
Right.
And you with emphasis on, you know, communication, trust, and respect.
Yeah. Manager relationship between artist and manager is closest thing to a marriage in the music business. They are, I always think of it as a manager being a funnel with the artist. The artist says, I want to do this, I want to do that. I want to tour here. I want to have a nice bus. I want to have this merchandise. I want to be on this record label, whatever. And it's the manager's job to pursue those goals, reaches out everywhere they can. And then they come back to the artist and say, here's your options, you know. And I personally would always leave decisions up to the artist, and only if they seem to be making a mistake, would I call them on it and have them, or I would always try to give the pluses and minuses in the most objective way for the artist to decide on their own, because it's their career, you know, they're the ones. It's also super necessary to have a good trust in your representative, because the artist should be focused on their art, and the representative is speaking to the rest of the business on your behalf. Are they classy and sophisticated? Are they come off as sleazy or not knowledgeable? You know, I'll go into one more thing here actually about, I think we mentioned before, but a lot of people in the beginning, you may not have the opportunity or making enough noise to attract a good manager or agent. And a lot of time you rely on friends or family, which may be necessary in the beginning, but it's really rare that friends or family are your good option later on when you're doing business with record companies and so on. And you need the respect and the cooperation of the record company. When a family member goes in and says, my dad or my son or whatever is the best, you know, it carries no credibility if that individual doesn't have other experience that they can trust their opinion on. So tricky situation also, if you're in that situation, you may have to fire a husband or a wife, you know, and I won't get into that. That's up to every individual, but challenging, you know.
Yes, I've actually experienced some of that from the legal standpoint. It's not fun. It's not fun at all to be in that sort of situation, no matter what role you're playing. By the time it gets there, it's not great. Mike, one of the things that you wanted to expand upon is, and you started talking about, in the last session, was what someone looks for, what managers look for. And I know that you were talking about that just now to some degree, but you literally sent 5 points that were really, really highly focused on that your agency would consider, starting with whether or not the artist actually moves you and what that means.
Right. Yeah, well, our agency, I should clarify, I started my own agency in 1976. And with the intention from the very beginning, having seen people go off to large agencies and get lost in the shuffle, I wanted to stay small and make sure nobody felt like they weren't getting the proper attention, and to do everything we could for them. So our situation, that's another point I wanted to clarify from before, was different. And I have my biases of staying small and focused, but if you can be in a larger agency and get the attention of all of the agents, or get the support of enough of the company, that could be the best situation, because more things come to them. They're aware of more things because they have a lot more artists and there's more people calling in about a brand new festival or something. They might not reach a smaller agency like we were. So I showed a bias towards small, and I've always had that bias. I've seen my friends go off and say, thanks for your help, we're going to the big time now. And few weeks later calling up and saying, please, can you get us any work? Because they get lost in the shuffle. So anyway,
right. Well, and that goes to
points.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say that kind of goes to your point to, kind of ascertaining whether or not the agency is right for any given artist. And I mean, in many ways, your agency, because it was so small, was very, very right for the artist that, signed with you. But you can expand upon that, the difference between having a smaller versus large agency and the advantages and disadvantages, which you already have to some degree, but if you want to.
Yeah, back to your point, your question initially is, what do we look for when we sign an artist? And again, it can be different for what we were as a boutique agency with really specialized in roots music, blues, jazz, gospel, folk, things like that. Not rap, not country, not really pop artists, really polished pop artists. It's just not our world. So for us, the first and biggest thing was, does the artist move us? I want to feel something, not just, hey, they're just like so-and-so, there's going to be a market there, we can make X amount of money, which may be a big factor for a lot of agencies. But for us, number one was, do they move us? And then are we the right agency for them? A like I said, we specialized in roots music particularly. And we had, if somebody came to us who wasn't the right realm and they heard good things about us, and we still might have to say, you know, we're not really right for you. We'd have to start a whole new circuit. With a major agency, that can be a plus, that, well, we'll send you to the country department, we'll send you to the rap department, whatever, because they have the different departments, but we were small and focused. So in fact, Tony Williams, who was actually he was drummer for Miles Davis when he was about 17 years old, I think. He was a monster musician. And I represented him for a while. Really lovely man too. I liked him a lot. We were very friendly. And he was highly regarded in the jazz world in particular, but we didn't really specialize in jazz. And I felt like if a jazz festival had a cancellation, they'd call up an agency specialized in jazz. And so I recommended he go there, actually, and we remained friends. But you have to work with the people who know your realm.
That's a really good point that you just made about a festival going to a jazz agent or an agency that specialized in jazz. That's something that I haven't thought about. This seems obvious, but I'm really glad you mentioned that. You brought that up insofar as, you know, when it comes to like substituting, and hey, we saw a lot of that during the pandemic, right? And are still seeing that as people, you know, as this pandemic continues without being called that, or whatever stage we're in, right? I say that in large part because, you know, I mean, that's something that was, you know, during the Jazz Fest since the pandemic. I mean, you would hear about these substituted acts, you know, constantly. And that's probably exactly what they did, right? Went to these various agencies. So that's a very good point. I'm glad you made that, Mike. Thank you.
Well, the Jazz Fest in New Orleans, you know, as anybody knows, it's probably on here, is not by any means just jazz. So
Well, of course.
they're
right.
mainly roots, so they'd go across the board. But there are festivals that are more specifically jazz, and they're already doing a ton of business with the jazz specialized agencies. So they have a cancellation, it's natural they'd go there first. So another of those points is, does the artist and the manager have realistic expectations? If somebody, I've had people come to us, very significant artists that selling out theaters that, you know, would fit very well with us, and they're looking for X amount of money. And I know I get box office reports from Post-Star magazine, publishes them from all over the world, and also average grosses. And if I see somebody asking for $25,000 and they're only drawing a grand total of $20,000 gross, they're being unrealistic. And then if I took them on, as big as the artist might be, it's going to be an unhappy family. And that's what I always want to have, is a happy family, people happy with our work, manage the expectations. We're not necessarily going to change the world for somebody as far as changing their price, but as a small company, we wouldn't forget about them, and we'd constantly push, ideally reaching more people about them specifically and their needs. I hope that makes sense.
It does. And real quick before you go on to the next point, Mike, I was just going to suggest to those of you who do not have a subscription to Polestar, you can do that online. I get, you know, newsletters from Polestar almost every other day, and it's really informative, and it's informative to the folks who are booking. So, and I would just recommend that everyone subscribe to that. You don't have to read everything, but it's good for, you know, a solid reference point. And, you know, Mike made reference in the last session, the importance of these numbers and what, you know, some of these venues and festivals and presenters look to, you know, and Polestar's, you know, one of the resources that is widely regarded, you know, insofar as determining an artist's marketability and value, et cetera. Right? Did I phrase that correctly, Mike? You can correct all of that, please.
The number one, it's the number one outlet for live music. I mean, it started out as Promoters Online Listing, POLL, and then anyway, it evolved, and now it's Polestar. They have an annual gathering of people across the live music industry. So, and they publish every week, any promoter anywhere over a certain dollar amount, their grosses, the ticket price, the gross, what percentage of the capacity of the building did they sell, so on. So your results of your shows, if they're on a big enough level, are being seen by people all over the world. So that goes into realistic expectations too, that you're not pulling the wool over anybody's eyes saying, we always sell out this or that, you know, they can check easily. Another thing we would look for, we would take a chance a lot of the time. My first booking I did for George Thorogood was $150 versus 100% of the gross receipts. And he didn't break the groceries. He didn't gross over $150. And a year later, we were turning down dates at $25,000. But we want to believe and trust that an artist will at some point cover our costs. We may lose money for a while and sometimes for a long while, but that's another factor we have to take into consideration, because I was not sponsored by anybody. And lastly, and really importantly, is that when we're looking at taking on an artist, is that the manager or the artist themselves is, we expect a good positive relationship. I was about to take on a fantastic guitarist who's no longer with us, but he was amazing artist. And he hired a new manager, and I talked to the manager, and he went on for about 45 minutes, barely touching on the artist, just all sorts of other things. And I thought, this guy's going to eat up my life, you know, and who knows when he gets down to business. So, you know, competent, I put it in competent, focused attention is what's key in a manager or an agent giving the artist what they need. Are they competent? Do they know what they're doing? Are they effective? Can they focus on you? I used an example in the last session, which I use a lot, in that I worked with a singer-songwriter who could have been James Taylor under different circumstances, actually more humorous than James, but similar sweet voice, great songs and everything. And he had what one would think would be a key to success. His manager, this is going way back into the 70s, managed Bob Dylan, Frank Sinatra, and John Denver, who had like 12 TV specials of his own, very pop artists, but these were three of the biggest artists in the world at the time. He managed them all simultaneously and did coast-to-coast tours with the likes of Led Zeppelin. He was the most powerful person in the music business. So this person that I represented as an agent signed with him as management and got nothing out of it because there was no focus. He was busy with everything else. Very impressive resume, but didn't help at all. He would have been better off with a neighbor who loved him. And so anyway, just another sideline point, but those are the things that we look for in our situation. Another situation could be more, like I say, genre might not be a problem with a major agency if they've got another department that handles that genre. And maybe they have to focus more on the income than the personal feeling for the artist because of their overhead. Who knows?
Right. One thing, and thank you for that, Mike. And I'm sure that there are some points that you'll want to go back to, but one of the things that you talked with me on the phone following, or that you addressed with me on the phone following our last meeting, and that you have said to me that you wanted to clarify today is, you know, in the last Zoom, you suggested that it was important for the artists to make it so that they were not easy to deal with, but that they were part of an experience that people wanted to repeat.
Right.
You said you wanted to distinguish that. You wanted to clarify that to some degree.
Thanks for bringing that up. I said in the last session that ideally an artist makes dealing with them an experience that others want to repeat. Mm-hmm. And I still believe that. However, I should have clarified that doesn't mean you should be a pushover and accept whatever terms somebody's offering you so that they remember you as a nice person. You still need to, knowledge is the key for everything. And the more you learn, you can determine perceive what's good for you and what isn't good for you, and stand up against what's not right for you. So, but if you do it in the right way, and diplomacy is huge in this business, if you do it in the right way, you might end up contradicting somebody, but end up gaining more respect from them because of your knowledge and the manner in which you deal with them. So,
Absolutely. And the last point that you wanted to, expand upon from the last Zoom was, again, when to get a manager agent. And I think you summed it up really well with the point you sent to me. So if you want to expand.
I hope I can recreate that.
It's
Well,
basically, go ahead. I can prompt you if you'd
You're not
like.
likely to get a manager or an agent until I've always focused more on live performance rather than a TikTok or a American Idol or something like that.
Well, we may not have TikTok tomorrow. I mean, we will. Let's just say it, but it is the subject of conversation today.
Yeah. But I don't think it's a good representation of, if I'm signing somebody for booking, or the booking is large part of what I want as a manager, I want to see them in that circumstance of performing live, and be moved ideally by it as well.
Right. And you said that if the artist is at the point where they can afford a manager and they can get a good one,
Right.
that the manager can be a crucial buffer between the artist and others so that the artist can focus on their artistry and less on the day-to-day business.
Yep.
Which is just a great overarching point.
So, yeah,
That's your point, by the way.
there are some people that manage themselves, or when they've been around a while, they know exactly what they want. They don't need guidance. They probably have more experience than their managers in many cases. And not to slight the manager, but Eric Clapton's manager is a wonderful manager, but he doesn't have to get involved in day-to-day recording plans or direction of the music. Same with Bonnie Raitt or Carlos Santana. Carlos and Bonnie both have their own companies. Rather than hiring a manager, they hire the people to do management roles for them. So that's another option, but it's not really affordable until you establish yourself considerably. But it all boils down to your own knowledge. Oh yeah, and I know what I was going to say with regard to the last point is that contradicting somebody, it's important not to be a pushover, but also not to be constantly on guard that you're being taken advantage of. And there's a million examples of artists being taken advantage of, but some get too focused on that point and they go into what I call the offensive defense. They're so determined not to be taken advantage of that they end up becoming the offending party because they're just difficult to deal with. It's like, and that all goes back to the trust factor too. You've got to have trust in your representative. Ideally, you have the same goals. As an agent and manager simultaneously for many groups, one or two people would ask me, isn't that a conflict? Not at all, because we're both going for the greatest success, the greatest opportunities and success. And so it's a team. In our case, I charge less for management than most managers because I felt we were combining the roles and we're not having to reach out, talk to other people to see what the manager wants.
Well, I think you've done a great job of pulling together, a lot of examples of why it is so important for the manager and the artist, or the agent and the artist, to maintain open lines of communication, to maintain trust and respect. And I'd like for you to, since we've recapitulated a lot of those points, go into some of the other more focused points that you wanted to get into in the second round. And, you had a pretty lengthy conversation with me about the difference between or not the difference between rather, but the relevance of geography when it comes to representation. And, whether it's important to have, scattering of agents or one responsible agent. And, you can speak to this much better than I'm doing right now. So please take over. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, so there's different types. First of all, there's different types of agencies. I always did it. And the way I learned it, I didn't know there was a different way at the time, 50 years ago or whatever. But I always did it with agents splitting the country by a geography. Now that means that in the Southeast, this one guy is the agent for all of our artists. And they may be the responsible agent for certain of their artists, but somebody else is responsible generally for several of the artists. And so we always wanted to be unanimous when we made any decisions about taking anybody on, because each of the agents would be booking shows for each of the artists. And, you know, in later years, and especially even after I stopped booking and managing, I felt like I may have been wrong there, because another type of agency is where there is one agent who does everything for that artist. And the benefit of that is that they are talking with the artist or the manager all the time. They get more, there's a greater sense of responsibility that it's in their hands to do everything. And so that may have been a benefit. My negative on that was that, how does somebody feel at a club when they hang up the phone from an agent selling this artist, and then they pick up the phone, it's another guy that sits in the cubicle next to him about a different artist, you know, and how, in a big agency, how many people are they going to talk to from the same agency, you know? But
Right.
so that was my negative on it. And also that for the agent to be able to keep track of the entire world of opportunities for their individual artists, as opposed to geographically the agent having built better relationships by more consistent work with people in their particular territory. So it's a toss-up. It's good to know, though, going into it, what is the situation if you're talking to an agency? Is this an agency that this guy who's signing me is going to do all my work, or is he going to just do his territory and other people are going to do it? Then if that's the case, then you really want to have the support of as many people as possible. And that same thing goes for record companies. I lean toward, when possible, a smaller record company, not too small, but a smaller record label with maybe major distribution. So you got the intention of the small label, but you got the power of the major distributor. That was an ideal in my world. But if you've got a larger record company that is all behind you, then that's the ideal. However, typically in a larger record company, it's easier, just like an agency, for them to, you're not happening, we've got somebody else that is, we're gonna, you know, we're just naturally getting more calls about the other thing and we'll focus there.
Right. Well, what I've experienced, you know, from a legal standpoint, you know, when it, to your point, these more middle-sized, if you will, which are still large record labels, but, you know, maybe not like the big three, right? Even if they're a sub of them, they tend to have accounting departments that respond faster. And like you said, I mean, if they have these major, you know, distribution wings anyway, and as long as they're doing the marketing and promoting and all of that, then I've found that it's much easier to manage the money and other dealings when it comes, you know, with labels that aren't, you know, gigantic, you know, and that's just from, you know, my perspective and through my particular role. So it's good to know that it's always nice to, when two different role players in the same sector, you know, are tracking on that. So anyway, go ahead.
So no problem. Yeah, it's the larger label, the smaller label, there's no hiding anywhere, you know. So and also those people at a smaller label may get a bigger bonus because of really doing a great job for you, but on a larger label, you lost in the shuffle. But in dealing with the labels, I'll just say one thing. I would, larger ones especially, they might blow you off more often, or they're just so used to saying, yeah, I'll take care of that, I'll take care of that. I'd say, when do you think you'll know by? And if they said Monday, then I'd mark down, I'll call them on Tuesday if I haven't heard anything, you know. And then after a while, they get used to the fact that they're not just going to be tossing you around. You have to be accountable.
Right. Well, there's a lot of turnover at the large labels too, a lot.
Absolutely.
I remember it taking me forever just to find the right person to get at Universal one time, just to pay them, just to get the tax ID number. The vice president of music licensing changed hands, I think 8 times in 6 months one year. This is a long time ago. I mean, this is when there was, you know, a lot of layoffs, you know, back when CDs were transitioning to MP3s as a sound like a dinosaur. But I was just so tickled by that, because I'm like, all I want to do is write a check and pay you. And it just couldn't get to the same person. to the right person in the right amount of time before they made the shuffle again. So I think that further bolsters your point. But I digress. So I know, speaking of, countings and payments, Mike, one of the things that you wanted to talk about, and let me know if you're not done talking about, when to get, a manager and agent, some of these other considerations, but I know that you definitely wanted to talk about more about, what it means to be paid properly and how you gauge that.
Yeah,
And if you're
I
ready to
will
get
back
that-
up to the when for manager and agent for a second. I mean,
Okay, of course.
it's when there's just too much for you to do, you can afford to have somebody do it. And you've got to be appealing. I always go back to live performance, but there's people that have. Harry Nilsson was a wonderful pop artist and an amazing artist who basically almost never performed live, period. And he had a wonderful career. He did one album with John Lennon. He was the favorite of all the Beatles while they were still active, and never really performed live. So everything is possible in this business, but I lean heavily toward live performance all the time. That's, can you recreate in front of me in a club or a concert what you've done on record, and can you move me and everybody else? And then you've got to have, I think, to attract a manager and an agent, what is going to make you appealing to them? I told you what made people appealing to us, but I think there's got to be something starting. Unfortunately, everybody starts at the bottom, and there's not a significant manager is not going to, take well, they could, but basically off to another part of this point, good managers are so hard to find that they get inundated by people wanting to be managed by them. So when you're up against so many others, you've got to stand out. So you've got to create a draw, back to the awareness, creating a draw, and also back to the awareness, as I mentioned before, in the last session, there's ways you can build an audience by getting on benefits, getting on support X slots, anywhere you can, where the crowd isn't just people who already know about you, but you're appearing in front of other people, hopefully on a compatible bill with a larger artist, and you can turn on some of their fans to you, or a festival or a benefit, wherever you reach an audience without having to draw the audience yourself. And I'm sorry, I jumped. What was the actual question you were starting there with, Ashley?
Oh, no, you keep going. I don't want you to miss any of your points. I asked if you wanted to get into whether artists, how artists know when they're being paid properly and how they gauge that. But if you still want to go on about, getting, when to get a manager, please, this is your session.
Hopefully that gave a good idea of it.
I think you've covered most of your points, but we can always get back. So
okay, so again, sorry, I didn't sleep enough last night. What the point again?
okay. We're all there with this daylight savings thing. So when do artists know whether they're being paid properly, and how do they gauge that?
I've worked with artists for decades, for multiple decades, and they have been around the business for many decades, and they still can complain about how much they're making and how much they feel they should be making, and look at their expenses and they're not covering their expenses. Well, these are all things that the artist has to deal with, really. Really in a nutshell, how many people are paying how much money to see your show, period. And if that's turns into a gross of $6,000, then you're not going to get more than $6,000, at least on a return, because if they know that they can't pay their additional expenses out of what you brought in, maybe you're really only one gauge, and it varies tremendously on the circumstances. If it's a bar that suddenly says, yeah, we can use you on Saturday night and we'll charge X number of dollars at the door, then they're not really changing their expenses that much. Maybe they can give you a guarantee versus 90% of the door or something, or the whole door. But in a theater situation, for instance, where the promoter has to bring in sound, bring in lights, bring in security and staffing, then they've got all these extra expenses to pay for beyond the band. So maybe you're going to end up in a situation like that, roughly 50% of the gross. Now, it doesn't matter to the promoter if you say, yeah, but I've got 3 extra people coming and we've got these extra expenses. That's your concern. You've chosen to add those expenses, and it's not the responsibility of the promoter. Promoter's prime concern is staying in business and having a successful venue. So similarly, and it goes to a point, another point that we're going to talk about is performing in your home turf and touring. So a very naive artist might think, I'm getting $500 a night here in my hometown, and they want to book me 100 miles away, and that's going to cost me the rental of vehicles and gas and so on and so forth. So I need $750 to play a gig 100 miles away, but they don't know you 100 miles away. So instead of being paid more because of your expenses, you're worth less if you haven't developed a reputation in that territory. So I've always felt like when we took on a new artist, I want to cover as much turf as possible, not only nationally, but internationally, so that as the artist grows, they're worth $20,000 in the United States, but they're also worth $20,000 in Australia and Europe. And they can go there instead of having to start from scratch in a territory they haven't developed the awareness yet. You know,
Well, and you had said, and I think it's okay for you to be candid. I mean, because you've worked with a lot of New Orleans artists, and you know that, you know, a lot of, I mean, you know, on the one hand, there are a lot of New Orleans artists that tour and that we'll talk about, you know, how much better they do. But then there's some people that just stay here and wonder why they're not getting, you know, the audience, they're not gaining the audience development and the opportunities and maximizing their you know, revenue sources. So if you want to like point directly to like the New Orleans area, you feel free to do that.
well, New Orleans actually was notorious, I felt, at least to me, for having the best music and the weakest business infrastructure behind it. And they'd have people who were charting records going way back and not touring. It just wasn't something they were prepared to do, or there's nobody there prepared to take on those roles. And I think it's less of a problem now, but you talk about people that just play at home. I think that's a recipe for difficulties, at least, that people take the artist for granted. I saw him twice already last month. I'm not going to go again this month and see him. You know, I'll wait a while and see if things change, but you want to make things special, and this goes for anywhere. You want to make your shows special, not again. They're back again, and in some cases, that 6 months is too frequent. 3 months is too frequent. But at home, you know, if you're going to be playing at home a lot, New Orleans is better for that because you've got a lot of people coming in, tourists coming in and everything, and there's some good local support. But still, I think it's important to try to make the shows different then. We're going to be doing this unique thing on this night. We're going to play all songs by this artist or all songs from our second album or whatever. Make it something special to keep people coming out when they've already had so many opportunities to see you. And again, back to what I was saying before, as far as building simultaneously as spread out as possible. Because sometimes, in addition to building the value before you've got $20,000 in expenses and you're only worth $2,000 in Australia, ideally you build the value simultaneously everywhere, and it works on every level. You can sell more records that way. And the other point I was going to make is you never know where there might be a territory that's much warmer to what you're doing. And you only find out by playing all over the place. And all of a sudden, I've had an artist sell double platinum in New Zealand, where most people skip New Zealand. But in Holland, you know, I represented Robert Cray, a very small country, but he did very well there. #1, #2 singles, and selling out 20,000 some seats and 9,000 seater for 3 nights. You know, that's a lot of people might have just skipped it. You know, but we went to Europe with Cray a lot in the early days, especially.
Right. Well, and then there was a comment in the chat section, but this is something that, I hear all the time, is that, for New Orleans artists, they often do better when, they, overseas or in other parts of the country. And I think that some of that has to do with, venues not paying as well here, but a lot of that has to do with supply and demand, even with the number of tourists coming in, the influx of tourists that we have. I mean, we have so much talent here, as you said. So that's why I think it's so important to distinguish oneself. And I love your advice about making sure that your shows are, not the same all the time.
So, go ahead.
And that goes to what you said, it's so important just to keep things fresh, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, New Orleans, there's a cachet to New Orleans, it's an extra drawing point when people tour outside the area and outside the country. A really extreme example was back 30 years ago or so, and earlier, blues artists, especially Chicago blues artists, where there's many places to play in Chicago, and they play there, but they were so taken for granted. You see significant blues artists playing for a few $100s versus how much comes in at the door or something. And they go to Europe and they'd be treated as kings. And it's just amazing. Muddy Waters and people like that going to Europe really got the regal treatment. And luckily somebody recognized that and brought them over, and it was actually one of the main things was a German promoter who established a touring festival. And he worked with Willie Dixon, who was in Chicago and worked. He's actually written so many of the classic blues songs. He knew everybody. And so he could say, you should get this guy, and then they tour them around Europe. And again, in a touring package, if they don't know one artist, maybe they know a couple others. And then that one artist that wasn't known gets the same exposure, maybe can come back on their own later. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But-
Mike, I don't want to, I want you to be able to make sure that you've hit all your points, but, so please continue. And whenever you feel like, taking a break, then we'll jump in and for a little Q&A. Take a second and, read through, take your time. Cause I know.
I think we could do that now, and there's other tangents that will surely spring up.
Okay.
I'm notorious for tangents. Sorry.
No, you're not. You're great. I mean, you have some of the best anecdotes of anyone I've ever listened to. So,
I guess one other thing, I'll mention one thing that I put in my notes is that if you're seeking an agent, I've had this happen to me several times, and actually at least twice from New Orleans artists saying, oh, we're making X amount of money and we're booked until next spring, and I find out later on that that was one booking from a festival, and that was the only booking between now and next spring. It's you don't help yourself by trying to seem more appealing by we make such and such, and maybe picking out the highest paying gig you've ever had. The agent can think if the agent should be knowledgeable if they're in a discussion about representation, and they can realize I can't satisfy you on that. I can't give you your top pay every night. Because the promoters, regardless of who the agent is, the promoter again wants to stay in business, and they're going to have a limit as to what they'll pay an artist, regardless of who's representing them. So it's another situation of being honest and straightforward and developing trust. You're no BS artist. You're not trying to make yourself seem bigger than you are.
One of the final points that you'd had and the points that you sent to me, and it's interesting because Mr. Mojo also made this point in the chat, was about making sure that you engage in ongoing professional development and education and opportunities to, explore resources, especially, resources that, don't cost you very much. But I mean, whether it's, networking and, going to, professional development events at, trade conferences or, and of course, I mean, for those artists interested, you can seek, resources and legal advice through the Ella Project, but there's a lot of resources, I mean, outside of New Orleans that are available to you. And it's just really important to stay, to ensure that as much about your business as you can, because it is your business, right? And that's something that I see some folks failing on. And I hate to use the word failing, but it's just kind of true. I think that, artists sometimes forget that their business is business, and I'm not stereotyping, I'm not, because I forget about that too, but, but it's just really important to stay proactive, right? And to make sure you're at least a little bit ahead of the game, right?
Yeah, it's absolutely essential knowledge, and it's about everything you can. And I did all the time. I never got to a point, even after 50 years of thinking, I got it. If there's new information to absorb, and there's always new information to absorb in the music business because it keeps evolving, and it doesn't necessarily all apply to any individual, but it's good to be aware. And then you, like I said earlier, you can not be taken advantage of by somebody. And I dealt with a lot of record deals over the years for different artists that I managed and some that I didn't manage. And I've made a few record deals just in the last few years after phasing out of most other work. And still, as a matter of fact, I did it with an agreement yesterday, literally, where I looked through something, I felt confident that everything was okay, but I still ran it past a lawyer just in case I'm missing something, because the something could be notwithstanding the above, blah,
Right.
blah, blah. Notwithstanding the above, it says all the things that made you comfortable, but notwithstanding the above, here's an exception. We're only going to pay you half for whatever, So
Yeah.
it's crucial to not miss anything, especially a contract, except for an individual night's gig, frequently lasts for a long, long time. A hassle I was just involved in related to circumstances I was dealing with 30 years ago.
Mhm.
Stuff doesn't go away as far as publishing, record royalties, things like that. So be careful, learn as much as you can. Don't count on others. You hire a manager or an agent, you think you got it covered. You still got to work. You still got to be as educated as possible and have that trust factor.
Mhm. Absolutely. Gene, do you want can I switch to you and we can try to do a live, not a live Q&A?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Mike. So what we're going to do, because we are getting a recording and it's so much better, I think, for those of us who are joining us on the on-demand version to actually hear questions, is we're going to try and bring people in. So everyone's muted right now. But for those of y'all who are on your desktop, if you look at the bottom, about 2/3 of the way through the bottom part of your taskbar, you'll see the reactions. And if you have a question, go ahead and hit that and hit the raise hand button. And then we can recognize you. And you can go ahead and ask your question of Mike. So I've got a question from Hans right now. So I'm going to bring Hans in. Hans, go ahead and unmute yourself and fire away.
Hi, how you doing, Mike? So I was wondering, so I'm an independent artist working with some young managers, and I know you typically structure payments to managers and agents and lawyers off of gross receipts, but we're trying to do it independently in a way where we could keep enough cash flow in the business so we don't need to take an advance from anyone. And I was wondering if you've ever structured payouts accounting for direct expenses like recording costs, for example, or on the agent side, accounting for a live band payment before paying out your partners, or if you've always done it off of gross receipts.
When you talk about before, my experience has been being the agent or the manager. And we would, as an agent, it's very simple. We'd take 10% of the bookings, the gross to the artist. And any variance from that, there's rare variances where they're really sacrificing to do a gig. But it's just the volume of things that artists can come up with saying this, well, this is hardship because of this and that. It's better just have a clean 10%,
Sure.
And on recording, however, I took a higher percentage royalty or commission on recording, but I also, it was only on the net, actually. I didn't take a percentage on the gross. If the artist got $100,000 budget, spent $50,000 making the record and they had 50,000 left over, that's what I would commission on.
Sure.
And
And-
so that all their other costs, their producer costs, their studio costs, all that is, cost of making a record, which I did not commission. That's me. Other people make commission on the gross, period.
Right.
And
And
Hans, just so you know, I mean, that is a distinction because Mike does, take off the net, and that's Mike's a good guy, and Mike's really good at what he does. And I'm not saying that all managers that take on gross, I'm not trying to suggest that they're not good managers, but there is a big difference between taking off the gross and net. I mean, huge. And like Mike just said, I mean, we're talking about, $50,000 in costs are deducted. I mean, that's a difference between, taking, tens of thousands of dollars and thousands of dollars. So,
Right.
yeah, it's important, really important to pay attention to.
Right. My managers and I kind of have an understanding that we're going to figure out whatever's going to work best for the partnership and for the company, but also want to both take care of each other. So if you don't mind me asking, what was the, in that example, what was the equity you were taking on like streaming income or recording income? And then what was the higher equity that you ended up taking for the net of that recording income to account for the fact that it was net?
We were completely 10% on live performance, but on recording income, and I wouldn't have split out different percentages for streaming or anything else, and
Sure.
like that will generally come through a record label anyway. So whatever, I had different agreements ranging from 10 or 15% to 25% on the nets on recording, depending on the artist. JJ Cale was his previous manager before me, took 50% of everything. And so when I went from being just his agent and I got a record deal for him. He's talked about how, well, we'll have to come up with a different situation for this. And he said, well, what about 50%? Is that okay with you? I said, no, I cannot take that much, So I was always proud of the fact that my first argument with JJ Cale was me saying, no, don't pay me that much. And he'd say, well, what about this? But he was a very generous person. If you're not familiar, he wrote Eric Clapton, the songs Eric Clapton did, Cocaine, After Midnight, and many others after that. So he made a good living without having to leave the house. After Midnight was probably on 5 or 6 Eric Clapton albums, selling millions each, just that one song. And there was many songs, many artists. But I wasn't involved in his publishing, actually, because that was all with the previous manager. So I got involved later on, much later on. But at any rate, I hope that answers your question. If not, please ask further.
No, that covers it and makes a lot of sense too. I think what we're going to figure out is something specific for each particular income stream. And then as far as the agency we work with, I don't think there's any kind of leeway there. They take their 10% off of gross either way. So yeah, appreciate you giving some insight.
Okay, no problem.
Perfect, Hans. Thank you, Hans, and thank you, Mike. Other questions that we may have, if people want to use the raise hand, we'll recognize you. If the raise hand looks complicated and you want to do it the old-fashioned way and put something in the chat, well, that works too.
And also, feel free to email myself or Jean if you have questions that come up, as they tend to, after these sessions, just like Mike had points that he wanted to make after the last session. I mean, there's very few meetings I've ever been to where I can think of all the questions that I want to ask in the moment. So everyone has our contact info for that. And I got a lot of them after our meeting last time. I expect to have more this time too. So
And Mike, we do have something that came in through the chat. Patricia, go ahead, type this in. I'll go ahead and read it since you already took the time to write it, Patricia. It says, as the manager, what is the range for negotiating a record deal and or publishing deal for an artist with independent versus major labels? And what consideration should be given to an artist, et cetera?
What is the range? Is that meaning what commission?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and Patricia, you can come in and clarify. So
You're good. So can everyone hear me? Okay.
yes.
Okay. So I just kind of getting a feel for making sure getting the artists fair on with respect to that. So like what would be something like of a range? I know it depends on like the artist's reputation, kind of like when you said you're going to different venues and stuff like that, depending on their draw in those different locations or whatever. But just as a general idea, like if you're going to look for a record deal or if you're looking to get a publishing deal, what kind of like range are they looking for in something like of a deal in that respect? I don't know if it makes sense or not. But.
What kind of range is who looking for?
Like if you're negotiating a deal, so like if you're going to the record deal and they're asking like, what are you looking for compensation wise, rate wise, or publishing deal, what are you looking at compensation wise or rate wise? I know that you're looking at the commission from a management perspective, but what will be fair or reasonable for an artist's interest when you're kind of petitioning something like that?
Well, pretty much the whole music business relates to the rich get rich and the poor get poor. You know, if you're negotiating a publishing deal, I've done a few, and JJ Cale, again, I just mentioned some examples. He was a very successful songwriter. So I was in a position to get much better deals for him than somebody who's not known as a songwriter, doesn't have any track record, any success record. So you do the best you can, but if you don't have a track record yet, it's going to be more difficult unless you really knocked somebody out. I had a very unusual example. I represented a band that came out of a refugee camp in Africa, in Sierra Leone. Actually, the camp was in Ghana, or Guinea, but they'd all gone there during the Civil War in Sierra Leone, and they formed a band, people that had not known each other prior. And there was a documentary done about them, and they wanted to tour. And it was a really moving documentary. And I just said, if they want us, they got us, And I had them showcasing, actually the people that did the film set up the showcases at South by Southwest. It was like a dream. They were performing next to they had a showcase which went great, but then they were around for another day or two. They were also showcasing their film, and they decided to play next to this club, and I was right behind them, traveling separately, and it was next to a hard rock club. And I said, there's people played at the Driscoll Hotel here the other night. That would probably be a better place to go. So they marched through the streets down to the Driscoll Hotel, put out a hat, started playing, got about $500 in not too long, which was about the equivalent of a year's salary for a good average worker in Sierra Leone. And then I was talking to a lawyer next to me, a lawyer friend, and I said, did I tell you their story? And I told him the story. And his friend had his ear on this too. He happened to be an executive at Warner Chappell Publishing. When I got home that night to my hotel, just about an hour or so later, I had an offer for $50,000 advance, which we turned into 100 or 150, I think, before we finished negotiating, which in a country where $500 is a pretty decent annual wage, this was phenomenal. So you never know. I mean, they impressed. They didn't have a track record, but they impressed, and the story impressed. And nowadays, the story is huge, more than it used to be. The big thing was getting airplay, and not everything was dictated by one consultant, one radio consultant. So there'd be, independent decisions made about what got on the radio in different cities. Now that's all a thing of the past. But at any rate, that was a guideline more so in the past. But now there's guidelines of track record. What have you done? What is your following? How good are you, Or there's just still, hopefully, some people who do by the seat of their pants and are knocked out by somebody and are willing to take a chance. So I don't know if that answers your question. The range is anywhere from, we're not going to give you any advance for your publishing, but we'll give you a deal where we take X percentage of it, 50% of it or something, to here's your $500,000 or millions of dollars in advance. And we'll take 10% of your publishing to administer your music worldwide. So, and you can move those figures right over to record companies too. It's again, rich get rich, poor get poor. If you've got a track record going in, you've got a much better negotiating standpoint, and you'll get offers, better offers right from the start.
Fantastic. Well, we're just about at time now, Mike. So I think we're gonna go ahead and wrap, unless there's anything that's absolutely cannot wait. Hearing none, I think let's go ahead and thank you for coming out and sharing even more knowledge with us. We really appreciate your time and expertise and, commitment to not just our form of art, but all forms of music, but especially our form of art, because we are biased here in New Orleans and know that you've done a lot for the New Orleans music economy, New Orleans musicians over the years, and it doesn't go unnoticed. So we really appreciate all of that so much and appreciate all of y'all for joining us on the Zoom. Ashley, Mike, you have final thoughts before we wrap for the day?
Well, just thanks to you guys for inviting me. Thanks for everybody for showing up, and I hope we shared something that's helpful down the road.
Thank you so much, Mike. We love you very much and really, really, really appreciate you tremendously. You're so generous with your time. So thank you again and again.
All right. Thank you. Y'all take care.
Okay. Y'all take care. See y'all later.
All right.